Sorry for the interruption. Hi again. So this is, as I said in the previous video, we have an oblique section in the heart that shows the four valves, the two semi-lunar valves, the pulmonary and the aortic valve. So here we have the pulmonary valve, and here we have the aortic valve. The two valves are semi-lunar valves. And then here we have the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve. So if you are ever asked about the atrioventricular valves, then we are talking about the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve. I might ask you about the hemodynamics that allow the atrioventricular valves to close. So what happens is that when the ventricles contract, there is an increased pressure inside the ventricles, and that increased pressure will cause elevation, upward rising or upward elevation of the cusps of the atrioventricular valves, and this elevation will make them horizontal and result in closure of the valve. Of course, the tricuspid valve is made of 3 leaflets, whereas the mitral valve is made of 2 leaflets only. I might also ask you about the function or the functions of the atrioventricular valves in general. So you would say it allows and prevents. And you must mention the type of blood that passes and the ventricle that receives. That's why if I ask in general, then you would say that the atrioventricular valves allow the passage of blood from the atria to the ventricles. And we have to remember to say during diastole, and it prevents the backflow or the regurg during systole. But if I ask you about a specific valve, like for example, the tricuspid valve, then you have to mention in detail the type of the blood. So you would say that the tricuspid valve allows the passage of deoxygenated blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle during right ventricular diastole and prevents backflow during right ventricular systole. Similarly, for the function of the mitral valve, it will allow the passage of oxygenated blood from the left atrium to the left ventricle and will prevent backflow during systole. So it allows during diastole and prevents during systole. Okay. And now what about the semi-lunar valves? Again, I might ask about the hemodynamics that result in closure of the semi-lunar valves. So the semi-lunar valves allow the passage of blood from the ventricles to the corresponding large artery during systole and prevent backflow during diastole. This is in general. But what are the specific hemodynamics that result in closure of the semi-lunar valves? So of course, as an answer to this question, you would say that during systole, the cusps of the semi-lunar valves get filled with blood because of the pumping of blood from the ventricles. So the cusps of the aortic valve would be filled with blood, and the cusps of the pulmonary valve would be filled with blood. Of course, this filling is a gradual filling. and the complete filling of the cusps with blood will occur at the end of systole, when all the blood that is supposed to be pumped has been pumped. So at the beginning of diastole, when the ventricles start to relax and when the pressure in the arteries, whether the aorta or the pulmonary artery, becomes higher than that in the ventricle, the cusps are already closed because they get enlarged and they get closer to each other, perfectly sealing the opening. Now, concerning valve coordination, during diastole, blood flows from the atria, which are the upper chambers, to the ventricles. And at the same time, during diastole, the semilunar valves, the pulmonary valve here, and the aortic valve should be closed. So they act oppositely to each other. And this is normal because during diastole of the left ventricle, the semilunar valve should be closed to prevent regurg. So if I ever ask you to explain how valve coordination occurs, you can take this specific example of diastole when the atrioventricular valves are open and the blood passes from the atria to the ventricle, but meanwhile, the semilunar valves should be closed. We have explained the content of that slide in the previous explanation, as well as the one on the semilunar valves. Now, we have also mentioned before that all blood returning to the heart from different parts of the body carries deoxygenated blood. What is deoxygenated blood? It's blood rich in carbon dioxide and poor in oxygen. We also mentioned the two big veins that carry this deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium. They are the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So the right atrium is the heart chamber that receives all deoxygenated blood from the upper part of the body via superior vena cava and from the lower half of the body via the inferior vena cava. What is the chamber that receives deoxygenated blood from the right atrium? It is the right ventricle. So the right ventricle receives deoxygenated blood from the right atrium. What is the large artery or vessel that receives deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle? It is the pulmonary artery. What is the process that allows loading of the blood with oxygen, and where does it occur? The process is the alveolo-capillary exchange. It occurs in the lungs and it allows unloading of the venous blood of carbon dioxide and loading with freshly breathed in oxygen from the air sacs. So the air sacs will give fresh oxygen to the capillaries, and the capillaries will give carbon dioxide to the air sacs. And this is how oxygenation of the venous blood occurs. You might also be asked about the chamber that receives all the oxygenated blood that comes back from the lungs after alveolo-capillary exchange. It is, of course, the left atrium. So all the oxygenated blood coming from the lungs will be received by the left atrium. Where does the left atrium pump oxygenated blood? Into the left ventricle. Where does the left ventricle pump the whole amount of oxygenated blood it receives? It is pumped into the aorta, and the aorta, as we said, is the largest artery in the body. It carries oxygenated blood, and it distributes blood, oxygenated blood, to all the parts of the body, to the head and neck and to the lower parts of the body. Why does the left ventricle have the thickest musculature or myocardium? Because the left ventricle pumps blood, as we said in the previous video, into the systemic circulation, meaning that it pumps blood for a longer distance and against a higher pressure. The control of the heartbeats is essentially via the pacemaker of the heart. And what is a pacemaker? A pacemaker is a structure that regulates the heart rate. So what does it mean that the sinoatrial node is the pacemaker of the heart? This means that the sinoatrial node will regulate the heart rate and rhythm, and will force all the myocardial muscles to follow its pace, to follow its rate and rhythm. And as a general rule, what is the condition for a muscle to contract? In order for a muscle to contract, it should first receive a nerve impulse, and that nerve impulse should be above the threshold to stimulate it. And when the cardiac muscle is stimulated by an adequate stimulus that exceeded the threshold, it will respond. What is the response of the muscle? The response of the muscle consists of two phases. The first phase is to contract, but at the same time, the electric stimulation or the depolarization that occurred over one myocardial muscle will spread to the neighboring muscle. And this is the topic of another question: how do electric impulses spread over the myocardium? When a muscle fiber receives an adequate stimulus and gets stimulated and responds by contraction, meanwhile it transmits these electric changes to the neighboring muscles, which will in turn be stimulated and will contract. Now, what is the pacemaker of the heart, or which structure is the pacemaker of the heart? It is the SA node. Where does the SA node lie? It lies in the posterior wall of the right atrium. Does the sinoatrial node need electric stimulation to generate an electric impulse and contract? No. And that's why this is one of the properties of the sinoatrial node that allow it to be the pacemaker of the heart. What is this property? It can, on its own, without external stimulation, generate its own electric impulses and transmit them to the rest of the myocardium and drive the whole atrial muscles and therefore the ventricular muscles to beat at its own rate and rhythm. How is the sinoatrial node well adapted to generate its own impulses? The sinoatrial node is adapted by being a specialized cardiac muscle fiber. Why is it specialized? Because it has an unstable membrane potential. So it is unstable. It can all the time generate electric impulses at its own rate. When the whole heart follows the rate of the sinoatrial node, we say, when the whole heart follows the rate of the sinoatrial node, we say that the whole heart is beating at the normal sinus rhythm. What is the AV node? It is another specialized cardiac muscle fiber. It has the same ability as the pacemaker of the heart to generate electric impulses on its own without external stimulation. So it is a specialized type of cardiac muscle fiber. It is a specialized type of cardiac muscle fiber. Why then isn't it the pacemaker of the heart? Because the rate of the sinoatrial node is slower, while the rate of the sinoatrial node, the rate of the AV node is slower. While the rate of the SA node is 60 to 90 beats per minute, the rate of the AV node is 40 to 60 beats per minute. The AV node is therefore a spare pacemaker of the heart. Whenever the SA node gets diseased, beating at a slow rate or beating irregularly, the AV node will act as the pacemaker of the heart. Meanwhile, the main function of the AV node is to relay and delay. Relay means transport the electric impulses from the atria to the ventricles, and delay means that the transport occurs at a slower velocity, and the importance of this delay of the AV node is, number one, to allow the ventricles to beat a fraction of a second after the atria so that they don't contract simultaneously, because if they contract simultaneously, there would be inefficient pumping of blood from the ventricles. Number two, to allow the ventricles enough time in diastole to fill with blood. So these are the important, this is the significance of the delay that occurs at the atrioventricular nodes. You might also ask to define systole and diastole. Systole means ventricular contraction, diastole means ventricular relaxation, and systole plus diastole represent one phase of the cardiac cycle. During systole of the ventricles, the atrioventricular valves are closed and the semilunar valves are open to allow passage of blood from the ventricles to the large arteries. During diastole, on the other hand, the semilunar valves should be closed to prevent regurg, and the atrioventricular valves are open to allow passage from the atria to the ventricles. Heart sounds, we have two heart sounds, S1 and S2, and both are due to closure of valves. So the origin of the heart sound, what is the origin of the heart sound? The origin of the first heart sound, S1, is closure of the AV valves, and the origin of the second heart sound, or S2, is the closure of the semilunar valves. Of course, the valves should be competent, meaning that they should close completely. At the same time, the valves should have a certain diameter, no smaller than that diameter. If the valves do not close perfectly, or if the valves are distorted because of a previous attack of rheumatic fever and get wider and cannot close properly, then we call this incompetence. When the valve is incompetent, whatever the reason is, there will be backflow of blood, meaning that the blood will flow in an opposite direction to the normal direction. When the valve, on the other hand, is too narrow, it will be stenotic, and the blood will pass against resistance. In both cases, whether we have backflow because of an incompetent valve, or whether we have blood flowing through a very narrow valve, we will have a murmur. What is a murmur? A murmur is an abnormal sound that is superimposed on the normal first and second heart sounds, and the cause of the murmur is the presence of a turbulent blood flow. If there is no murmur in between S1 and S2, this is the norm, or between S2 and the next S1, this is the norm, because the flow of blood through the valves should be smooth laminar flow. If the blood flow is turbulent or non-laminar or non-smooth, then we hear a murmur. This is this diagram is an audiogram, and it shows the first heart sound and the second heart sound. Where is systole? First heart sound is closure of the atrioventricular valves. Second heart sound, this is closure of the semilunar valve. So the distance between the closure of the time lapse between the closure of the semilunar valves and the closure of the closure of the atrioventricular valves, which is S1, and the closure of the semilunar valves, which is S2, this time is systole. and the time between S2 and the next or the following S1 is diastole. As you can see, diastole is longer than systole, and this is important, as we said before. Justify. This is diastole is the period of relaxation of the ventricles, and therefore it is the period of filling of the ventricles with blood. So a longer diastole is important to allow adequate time for the ventricles to fill with blood, and at the same time to allow adequate time for the ventricles to relax in order to prevent fatigue of the myocardial muscles. If while listening to the heart, while auscultation with a stethoscope, you find a murmur in between S1 and S2 in the shorter period, then it is a systolic murmur. And if you find a murmur between S2 and S1, then it is a diastolic murmur. Of course, the auscultation areas are important. We have the aortic area and the pulmonary area. They are both present at the second intercostal space. The aortic is to the right sternal edge. The pulmonary is to the left sternal edge. And then we have Erb's point. Where is Erb's point? It is in the third intercostal space at the left sternal border, and the importance of Erb's point in cardiology in particular is it is the place where aortic regurg sounds are best heard. And then we have the tricuspid area and the mitral area. The tricuspid area is fifth intercostal space at the lower left sternal edge, and the mitral area is fifth intercostal space, but along the mid-clavicular line. What do we mean by aortic area? If I ask you to define, the aortic area is the area where aortic sounds or sounds originating from the aortic valve are best heard, and then you describe the location. What is the pulmonary area, or what's meant by the pulmonary area? It is the place where sounds from the pulmonary valve are best heard, and then you define the location. Of course, needless to say that the mitral area is the apex of the heart. As we said before, a whole cardiac cycle includes a whole systole and a whole diastole, and it starts at the beginning of one beat, cardiac beat, lob, and it ends at the beginning of the second cardiac beat, which is the following lob. So lob, dop, and the space of time afterward, this is a whole cardiac cycle. Of course, we will skip this slide and that slide because we haven't discussed them in detail. Of course, the importance of the electrocardiogram can be deduced from all the study we have done on the ECG. You can detect the normal, the heart rate, how many beats per minute. You can detect whether it's regular or irregular, so you can detect the presence of arrhythmias. You can also detect whether these arrhythmias are of atrial origin or ventricular origin. You can detect ischemias like angina pectoris and myocardial infarction, mainly through visualization of the ST segment. A raised ST segment is an indication of myocardial infarction, whereas a depressed ST segment is an indication of myocardial ischemia. You can also detect conduction defect, like, for example, an elongated PQ interval, and you can detect other conduction defects as well, but you can also detect enlargement of the atrium when you have a tall or wider, broader than normal P wave. The normal ECG components, of course, are seen on the diagram. The P, you might be asked about what each wave represents. So the P wave represents atrial depolarization. The atrial repolarization is masked by the QRS complex. The QRS complex, which consists of three waves, a first negative Q deflection, and then a second positive tall wave, which is R, and then a third negative S wave. All this represents overall the ventricular depolarization. Ventricular repolarization is represented by the T wave. It's important to know where each segment starts and where it ends. And it's important to know the difference between a PR segment and a PR interval. An interval is a segment plus a wave. So the P wave plus the PR segment form together the PR interval. What does the PR segment represent? It represents the time needed for transfer of depolarization from the atria to the ventricles. And it starts at the end of the P wave and begins at the and ends at the beginning of the Q wave. And it is it might be prolonged if we have a conduction defect in the AV node, or in case of the AV nodal rhythm, on the other hand, it might be shortened or absent. The PR interval represents spread of it represents the time needed for the depolarization to spread from the atria to the ventricle. Whereas the PR segment, I'm highlighting it again, the PR segment represents the time needed for spread from the atria to the ventricles, not along the atrial muscles. The QT interval, as we said before, it starts at the beginning of the Q wave and ends at the beginning of the ends at the end of the T wave, and the QT interval shouldn't be more than 0.44 seconds. And if it is elongated, which might be congenital or as a side effect of medication, this is dangerous because it might be initiating a fatal arrhythmia like torsade de pointe. I'll stop here and then send you another part of the video later on. Thank you.